The morning Ezekiel Keene rode back into Dust Creek with 43 stolen cattle was the morning Myrtle Turner decided she was done crying over things she could not change. And then everything changed anyway. It had been a brutal summer in the New Mexico territory, the kind that cracked the earth like old leather and turned the sky into a white-hot sheet of iron. The year was 1882, and the territory was still wild enough that a woman could lose everything she owned between Tuesday and Wednesday without a soul lifting a finger to help her. Myrtle Turner had learned that lesson personally. She had learned it on a Thursday. The Triple T Ranch, which had belonged to her father, Harold Turner, before he passed in the spring from a fever that swept through the valley like bad news, had been struggling since the day she took it over. Harold had left her the land, the house, and a herd of 61 cattle that represented every dollar of worth the Turner family possessed. Within 3 weeks of Harold's funeral, someone had come in the night and taken 43 of those cattle, leaving behind nothing but churned dirt and the low, haunted lowing of the 18 animals that remained. The sheriff in Dust Creek, a man named Floyd Cass, who had the disposition of a man who had long since stopped caring about anything that did not directly affect his own comfort, had taken one look at the tracks and told Myrtle that cattle wandered sometimes, and she ought to be patient. Myrtle Turner was 24 years old, dark-haired and brown-eyed and built with the kind of quiet strength that came from years of actual physical work rather than claimed toughness. She had grown up hauling feed and mending fences and riding the property lines in the early morning dark, and she was not a woman who could be easily dismissed. But even she, standing in the sheriff's doorway with mud on her boots and grief still raw behind her eyes, had understood that Floyd Cass was not going to help her. The law in Dust Creek was a comfortable fiction, and the fiction was not writing any new pages on her behalf. She had ridden home with 18 cattle and a jaw set hard as ironwood, and she had done her arithmetic. Without the missing herd, she could not make it through the winter. Without making it through the winter, she could not maintain the ranch. Without the ranch, she had nowhere to go and nothing to fall back on. Her mother had died when Myrtle was 11. She had no siblings. The only family she had was a distant aunt in Santa Fe, who had made it clear years ago that she considered ranching to be a low and dusty business unsuitable for women of refinement. Myrtle had no intention of appearing on that woman's doorstep, so she worked. She mended fences until her hands were calloused past the point of pain. She went to the feed store and negotiated credit with a man named Horace Petty, who gave it to her reluctantly, and only after she agreed to pay interest she could not comfortably afford. She wrote letters to the neighboring ranchers asking if they had seen her brand on any wandering stock, and she received polite non-answers in return. She prayed, in the practical, boots-on-the-ground way she had always prayed, without expectation but with sincerity, because there was nothing else to do once you had done everything you could. It was on a Thursday morning, 6 weeks after the theft, that she walked out to the porch with her first cup of coffee and saw the dust rising on the eastern road. The dust was not the loose, careless kind that came from a single rider. It was thick and rolling and low to the ground, the kind that came from a herd in motion, and Myrtle set her coffee cup on the porch rail and stood very still, because her heart was doing something complicated in her chest that she was not sure she could trust. She was still standing there when the cattle came around the bend in the road, and then she saw them, a river of brown and white and red, lowing and pressing together in the particular way of cattle that have been moved too fast and are glad to be slowing down. And riding behind them, flanking them, pushing the stragglers back into line with the calm efficiency of someone who had handled cattle for a long time, was a single rider on a gray horse. He was tall in the saddle. That was the first thing she noticed. He had the kind of height that showed even when a man was sitting, a length of leg and a straightness of back that made him look like he had been put together with some care for proportion. He wore a dark coat that had seen better years and a hat that was pulled low against the morning sun, and he rode with the reins loose in his left hand, his right hand resting on his thigh. As he came closer, she could see the line of a jaw that was square and unshaven, dark stubble on brown skin, and eyes that were looking directly at her. He stopped the herd at the edge of her property, which surprised her, because most men in her experience rode onto a property they were approaching without asking permission. He sat there on the gray horse and the cattle shuffled and settled around him, and he looked at her standing on the porch, and she looked at him standing in the road, and neither of them said anything for a moment that stretched longer than it should have. "Are these your cattle?" he called out. His voice carried well without being raised, the way voices carried in open country, clean and direct. Myrtle came down the porch steps. She walked to the fence line and looked at the herd, and she could see the Triple T brand on the nearmost animals, faded but legible, and something in her chest loosened in a way that was almost painful, like a knot coming undone that had been pulled so tight for so long that the loosening hurt. "They are," she said. "That is the Triple T brand. This is the Triple T ranch." She paused. "Where did you find them?" He swung down from the gray horse with one easy movement. He was even taller on the ground, she noticed. He was perhaps 27 or 28, with the weathered look of a man who spent his life outside, but under the weathering there was a younger face, and the eyes that she had seen looking at her from the road were dark brown, almost black, and looked at things with a directness that she was not used to. 43 head, he said, as if answering a different question. "I counted them 4 times because I wanted to be sure." He pulled his hat off and held it at his side, and the morning light hit his face fully, and Myrtle Turner, who had not had time to think about anything except survival for 6 weeks, felt something catch low in her throat. They were being held in a box canyon about 30 miles east of here in the Reed Rock Draws. A man named Cole Bartlett had them. He had 6 hands working for him and about 200 head of mixed stock, some of which were certainly not his. Myrtle absorbed this. "Cole Bartlett," she repeated. "I know that name. He has a spread over near the border." "Had," the man said. "He no longer has that spread. He and his hands rode out 3 days ago when they understood that continuing to hold those cattle was going to result in consequences they found unpleasant." He paused, and there was something careful in the way he said it, like he was choosing words with deliberate attention. "I brought your cattle back." Myrtle looked at him for a long moment. "You brought 43 head of cattle 30 miles across open country alone," she said. It was not quite a question and not quite a statement. It was the kind of thing you said when you were trying to understand the shape of something. "I did," he said. "That is a significant thing to do," she said, "for a stranger's cattle." "I know it," he said, and he was still looking at her with those direct, dark eyes, and the morning light was warm now, and the cattle were settling into the grass along her fence line, and the whole thing had a quality of unreality that Myrtle kept trying to blink away. "I would like to ask you something, if I may." She crossed her arms over her chest, not because she was cold or defensive, but because it was a posture that helped her think. "You may ask." He looked at her for a moment that lasted just long enough to make her wonder what he was working up to. The gray horse shifted behind him, and somewhere in the middle distance one of the cattle lowed long and low, and the morning kept being the morning, unremarkable and golden and full of this strange, still tension. "What is your name?" he said. Myrtle Turner stared at him. Out of everything she had imagined he might ask, a fee, a reward, a meal, an explanation, a favor, anything a man might reasonably want after 30 miles of driving cattle across the New Mexico territory, she had not imagined that. She had not imagined that the only thing he would ask, the one thing, the single coin he would take in exchange for returning the most important possession she had in the world, was her name. "My name," she said. "Yes," he said. She looked at him for a long time, long enough that most men would have shifted or looked away or added something to fill the silence. He did not shift. He did not look away. He stood there in the morning light with his hat in his hand and waited, and there was something about that patience, that absolute stillness, that did something to her she could not have explained to anyone, least of all herself. "Myrtle," she said. Myrtle Turner. Something moved across his face, quiet and swift, like a fish moving under still water. Myrtle Turner, he said, as if he were committing it to some internal record. And yours, she asked, because it seemed only fair. He put his hat back on. Ezekiel Keene. He helped her move the cattle to the south pasture, because 43 head of cattle needed to be moved, and it was a two-person job whether either of them acknowledged that or not. They rode parallel to each other along the herd's flanks, and they did not talk much, but the silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who were each paying attention to the same thing and did not feel the need to perform conversation over the top of the actual work. Myrtle knew the south pasture gate, and she swung it open and watched the cattle funnel through with the particular satisfaction that came from things returning to where they belonged. Ezekiel Keene rode the far side and kept the stragglers moving, and he did it well, she noticed. He rode like a man who had grown up with cattle, not like a hired hand who had learned the basics, but like someone for whom this was native knowledge, deep in the body. When the last animal was through and she had latched the gate, she turned to find him sitting on his horse a few yards away, watching her, and she could not read the expression on his face well enough to know what it meant, but it was not the expression of a man who was about to leave. "You should come inside," she said. "I can make coffee, and there is bread from yesterday that is still good." He hesitated for just a moment, and she had the sense that hesitation was unusual for him, that he was a man who typically moved through decisions quickly. "I don't want to impose," he said. "You brought back 43 cattle," she said. "You are imposing nothing." He came inside. The kitchen of the Triple T house was the kind of kitchen that told you things about the people who lived in it. It was not a large kitchen, but it was a well-organized one, clean in the practical way of a place where cleanliness was a matter of efficiency rather than pride, and there were small marks of personality in it that Myrtle had accumulated over years without quite meaning to. A dried bundle of sage hanging above the window, a row of carefully labeled tin containers along the shelf, a chair near the stove that was lower than the other chairs, which had been her father's, because Harold Turner had had a bad knee that was easier on him when he sat lower. Ezekiel Keene sat at the table and looked at the kitchen with an expression that was quiet and careful, and Myrtle made coffee and set bread on the table and a knife, and they sat across from each other in the morning light that came through the east window, and Myrtle Turner, who had not had another person at her kitchen table in 6 weeks, felt the specific ache of that loneliness become briefly visible to her in the way it could only become visible when you were suddenly, unexpectedly, not alone. "How did you know the cattle were in the Redrock draws?" she asked. He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup and looked at it for a moment before he answered. "I know Cole Bartlett," he said. "I know the kind of work he does and where he does it." "You know him from Criminal Enterprise?" she asked. She said it directly, because she had always found that directness was the most efficient path through a conversation, and because something about the way he had said it told her that was exactly what he meant. He looked up from his coffee and met her eyes, and she saw something in his face that was close to appreciation, the specific appreciation of a man who had been asked a blunt question and did not have to decide whether to be offended by it. "Yes," he said. "I spent some years in that country, not with Bartlett specifically, but in the same general territory." "Are you still in it?" she asked. "No," he said, and the word was simple and flat and entirely convincing in the way that only genuine answers were. "I have not been in it for some time. I am trying to be not in it in a more permanent way." Myrtle considered this. She had grown up in a territory where the line between outlaw and respectable citizen was not always the clear, bright line that Eastern newspapers liked to draw, where men moved back and forth across it depending on circumstances, where a man who had done bad things was not necessarily a man incapable of doing good ones. She was not naive about what he was telling her, but she was also not prepared to condemn him for a history he seemed to be in the process of leaving. "Why did you bring the cattle back?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, a meadowlark was singing in the way meadowlarks sang in August, bright and persistent and slightly oblivious to the gravity of things. "I came through this way 3 weeks ago," he said. "I passed this ranch. I saw a woman working the fences alone. I saw the brand. A few days later, I passed through the Red Rock country and I saw the same brand on cattle in Bartlett's Canyon." He paused. It seemed wrong to know that and ride past. "Most people would have ridden past," she said. "Most people," he agreed, without expanding on whether he thought that was a flaw in most people or simply a fact about them. Myrtle looked at him across her kitchen table, at this strange, quiet man who had ridden 30 miles with her cattle and asked for nothing except her name, and she thought about the kind of loneliness that could make a person do a generous thing just to feel connected to something decent, and she thought that she probably understood that better than most. "Where are you going?" she asked. "After this?" "I am not certain," he said. "That is a truthful answer." "Are you wanted?" she asked. "Anywhere specific?" His mouth curved slightly, just at one corner in a way that was not quite a smile but was in the general neighborhood. "Specific is a complicated word in this context," he said. "That is a yes," she said. "It is a complicated yes," he said. "There are warrants in Texas that I believe are no longer being actively pursued. There was a situation in Colorado that was resolved. The New Mexico territory is, to the best of my current knowledge, not actively seeking me." He looked at her steadily. "I am telling you this because you deserve to know what is sitting at your table." Myrtle nodded. She drank her coffee. She was aware that she was not afraid of him, and she was also aware that this absence of fear was not the absence of awareness. She was aware of him in the way you were aware of a fire in a hearth, something warm and real and present that commanded attention without necessarily being dangerous. "You can stay in the barn tonight if you want," she said. "There is a loft and I have extra blankets. It is more comfortable than the open country." He looked at her with an expression she could not fully decode. "That is a generous offer," he said. "It is a practical offer," she said. "You drove 43 cattle 30 miles. You should sleep in a barn at minimum." He stayed in the barn. She did not sleep particularly well, which she attributed to the excitement of having her cattle back and the residual grief and stress of the preceding weeks. And she absolutely did not attribute to the awareness of a certain man sleeping in her hayloft, which was a ridiculous thing to be aware of, and she was certain she was not particularly aware of it. In the morning, she found him already up, already moving, already mending the section of the fence line along the east pasture that had been troubling her for 2 weeks. He had found her tools in the linta where she kept them, and he was working with the focused efficiency of a man who did not need direction, and she stood at the corner of the barn watching him for a moment before he heard her and straightened and looked at her with the morning sun behind him. "You do not need to do that," she said. "I know I do not," he said. "The fence is broken." She could not argue with that, so she made breakfast and brought him a plate out to the fence line, and they ate sitting on the ground with the fence between them and the cattle moving peacefully behind it. And Myrtle thought that she had not eaten a meal in 6 weeks that did not taste like worry. And this one, sitting in the dirt with a man she had known for less than a day, tasted like something else entirely. She asked him where he was from, and he told her. Born in Missouri, raised partly in Missouri and partly in the Indian Territory, his mother having been half Cherokee and his father a horse trader of uncertain repute who had drifted in and out of their lives on a schedule that suited him. He had come west at 17 and had not gone back east, and the West had been various things to him since then, most of them hard and some of them worse. And now he was here, in the New Mexico Territory, with no particular plan and a gray horse, and a reputation that he was trying to outrun. She told him about Harold, and about the ranch, and about the cattle theft, and about Floyd Cass's comprehensive indifference, and about the 6 weeks of working herself to the edge of exhaustion with the specific kind of fear underneath everything that came from knowing that one more bad thing, just one more, would be the thing that broke her. She told him this without self-pity, in the same matter-of-fact tone she used for everything, and he listened in the same way he did everything, with complete and unhurried attention. "Your father built this place?" he asked. "He did," she said. "He came out from Tennessee in 1858 with my mother and 2 mules and not much else. He spent 20 years building it into something. He was proud of it." She looked out at the pasture, at the cattle moving through the August grass, some of them hers and some of them hers returned, and the some of them feeling like something that could actually be sustained. "I intend to keep it." "I believe you," Ezekiel Keene said. He stayed 3 days. Each day, he found something that needed doing and did it. He repaired a section of the barn roof that had been leaking since spring. He fixed the south water trough that had developed a slow seep. He rode the property line with her in the early mornings and showed her where the soil was different, where the grama grass was thinning, where a new fence line would make the winter rotation easier. He knew the land in the way that people who had spent years reading landscapes knew it, and she found herself listening to him talk about the country, the elevation and the grass and the water sources, with a kind of attention she had not expected. She also found herself watching him when she thought he was not looking and noticing things. The way he moved, which was careful and deliberate without being slow. The way he listened, which was total. The way he laughed, which he did rarely but genuinely, a real laugh that came from somewhere deeper than performance, and which, when it happened, startled her with how much she liked the sound of it. On the 3rd evening, she made a proper supper, the first real supper she had made in months, with beans and salt pork and cornbread and dried apple from the stores she had been rationing. They sat at the kitchen table again and ate and talked, and outside the evening was cooling toward autumn and the first stars were coming out over the mesa, and Myrtle thought that there was something dangerous about this comfort she was feeling, and she thought it anyway. "You should tell me what your plan is," she said. "You said you did not have one. That seems like a problem." He looked at his plate. "I have been thinking about that," he said. "Have you thought of anything?" He looked up at her then, and there was something in his face that she had not seen before, a kind of careful vulnerability that sat oddly on features that were otherwise so composed. "I have been thinking," he said slowly, "that this territory is large enough that a man could find a piece of land and work it. That a man who worked hard and kept to himself and stayed out of the kind of trouble he used to make could build something honest." He paused. "I have been thinking that I do not want to keep riding." Myrtle kept her eyes on his and said nothing, and the kitchen was very quiet except for the sound of the wind coming around the corner of the house and the distant sound of the cattle settling for the night. "I also," he said, "have been thinking about whether it would be inappropriate to tell you that the last 3 days have been the most." He stopped. He looked down at the table, and she saw something move in his jaw, a small, controlled thing, and then he looked back up. "The most settled I have felt in a very long time, and I do not know how to say that without it sounding like something you should be alarmed by." Myrtle Turner was quiet for a long moment. She was a careful woman, careful in the way that people who had been hurt by the world got careful, not cold, not closed, but deliberate about what she allowed inside the perimeter of herself. She had watched him for 3 days. She had watched him work and talk and listen and move through the world, and she had formed an opinion of him that she trusted, because her opinions were formed on evidence rather than feeling alone, and the evidence was considerable and consistent. "I am not alarmed," she said. He exhaled just slightly, and she was glad she had said it. "There is land for sale," she said. "About 4 miles northeast of here, along the Rio Seco, Johnson's place. He went back to Kansas in June and left the land with the county agent. It is not expensive because the house needs work and the well was poorly dug." "How do you know about it?" he asked. "Because I made it my business to know what was available near me," she said. "Because knowledge of what is around you is part of how you survive out here." He looked at her with those dark eyes and that quiet, specific way of looking at things. "You are a remarkable person, Myrtle Turner," he said. She felt warmth move through her that she had no intention of letting show on her face. "Go look at the Johnson place," she said. "If it suits you, talk to the county agent. His name is Pemberton and he is honest, which is unusual enough around here to be worth noting." He went to look at the Johnson place the next morning. She did not go with him because she had her own work to do and because she thought they were both at the stage of this, whatever this was, where it was wise not to rush things. She spent the morning with her cattle and her fences and the quiet, purposeful rhythm of work that she had always found centering, and she did not think about Ezekiel Keene more than was reasonable, which was to say she thought about him a moderate amount, which she considered acceptable. He came back in the afternoon. He came to the house and knocked on the door, which she noticed, because he had stopped knocking somewhere around the second day, and the return to knocking told her that the morning had changed something, that he was resetting to a formality because he had something to say that required it. She opened the door. He stood on the porch with his hat in his hand, and the afternoon sun was behind him, and he looked at her with an expression that was open in a way his face had not been before, that early controlled carefulness laid aside. "It is a good piece of land," he said. "The house needs work, but the structure is sound. The well can be properly dug deeper. The grass is good." He paused. "I am going to talk to Pemberton." "That is good," Myrtle said. "I wanted to tell you first," he said, because another pause, and she was beginning to understand that these pauses were not uncertainty but precision, that he paused when he was choosing words the way a careful carpenter chose wood for fit and quality. "Because the proximity to this place is part of why it seems right, and I think you should know that." Myrtle looked at him for a long moment. "I am glad you told me," she said. He talked to Pemberton. He bought the Johnson place with money that he mentioned, carefully and without elaboration, had been legitimately earned over the past year and a half from ranch work in Colorado, which she believed, and which she appreciated him mentioning without being asked. The transaction took 10 days, during which he camped near the Rito Seco and came to the Triple T most evenings for supper, and Myrtle began to set 2 places at the table without thinking about it, which was either domestically practical or romantically significant, and possibly both. By September, he had moved into the Johnson place, such as it was, and had begun the slow, systematic work of making it better. She rode over twice a week, ostensibly to see how the work was going, actually because the twice-a-week visits were the most alive she felt in any given week, and she was honest enough with herself to acknowledge that, even if she was not entirely ready to acknowledge it to him. He came to her as often. He brought things, practical things, a repaired piece of harness, a bag of extra feed when he noticed her stores running low, information about weather and road conditions, and the movements of men he recognized passing through the territory. He was useful in the unshowy, comprehensive way that made her feel, for the first time in months, that she was not carrying everything alone. There was an afternoon in September when it rained, which it did rarely enough in August and September to be remarkable, and she was out checking the cattle when the rain came in from the north fast and cold. She rode to the nearest shelter, which was a section of red rock outcropping about a mile from her eastern fence line, and she dismounted and stood under the overhanging rock with her horse, watching the rain turn the dusty land dark. She heard hoofbeats and turned, and it was Ezekiel on the gray horse, coming at a canter, having evidently been caught in the same rain and having evidently come to the same shelter without knowing she was there. He came under the overhang and stopped, and they looked at each other, both of them wet, and he started to laugh, that real laugh she had been cataloging with considerable interest, and she started to laugh too because there was nothing else to do about it. "Your cattle are fine," he said, because he had passed them. "They are standing in the rain looking personally aggrieved by it." "That sounds right," she said. They stood under the rock while the rain came down outside, close to each other in the way that limited space made necessary, and their horses stood pressed together because horses preferred company in rain, and the air smelled like wet stone and sage, and Myrtle was very aware of the warmth of him beside her. "Can I ask you something?" he said. You can ask me things, she said. You already have. The first thing I asked, he said, and his voice was different, lower and more careful, was your name. Which is, I realize, an unusual thing to ask. It was the only thing I wanted to know because I could already see the kind of person you were. The work and the ranch and the way you were standing on the porch that morning. I did not need to know anything else first. I just needed to know what to call you. Myrtle looked at the rain falling silver and straight beyond the rock. And now that you know, she said. Now that I know, he said, I want to know everything else if you are willing. She turned to look at him and he was looking at her and his face was entirely honest, entirely open, no armor on it. The gray horse pressed its nose against her mare's neck in a familiar way, and outside the rain was easing toward a fine mist, and Myrtle Turner thought that she had been careful for a very long time, and that careful was sometimes right and sometimes merely afraid, and she wanted to be able to tell the difference. I am willing, she said. He reached out and took her hand, and his hand was warm and certain around hers, and the gesture was not dramatic or complicated. It was simply the touch of someone making a decision and wanting it known. She did not pull back. She turned her hand in his so their fingers aligned. They stayed under the rock until the rain stopped, talking and not talking, warm against the cooling of the wet day. And when the rain was done and the sky was clearing to a swept, brilliant blue, they rode back to the Triple T together, and Myrtle made coffee again, and the coffee was the same as always but the kitchen was different now, fuller. And she thought that maybe this was what the house had been waiting for since Harold died, for this particular weight and warmth at the table. October came in with cold nights and warm days, the best kind of October that the New Mexico territory offered. The sky, a deep particular blue over the red and tan of the land. The work on the Johnson place continued, and Myrtle helped now, going over on Saturdays when her own work permitted, bringing food and her hands and her opinions about where the new window should be placed to get the best morning light. And Ezekiel listened to her opinions with a seriousness that she had not experienced before from any man, and which she found, if she was honest, enormously attractive. There was a day in mid-October when they were working on the new window frame, and she was holding one side while he fitted the other, and they were standing very close together as the work required, and she could feel the warmth from his arm against hers through the fabric of her sleeve, and he was concentrating on the frame, his face close to hers, and then something made him turn just slightly, and she was already turned and they were very close, and the window frame sat between them. He looked at her. She looked at him. The afternoon was completely quiet except for a jay somewhere in the juniper trees at the edge of the property. Myrtle, he said, and just her name in that low, careful voice, was a thing that moved through her like light through water. Yes, she said, which was not exactly an answer to anything he had asked but was absolutely an answer to everything he meant. He kissed her. It was a careful kiss, deliberate and warm, and she kissed him back, and the window frame was still between them, which made them both start laughing at approximately the same moment, because they were both people who could see when something was funny even when it was also important, and the laughter made it better, made it more real. He set the window frame down. She set the window frame down. They looked at each other in the afternoon light with the laughter still fading on their faces, and it was the best she had felt in longer than she could precisely calculate, and she thought that she had better hold onto this feeling well enough to remember it accurately, because the good feelings in her experience deserved to be remembered. I should tell you something, he said. Tell me, she said. I have not been he paused, choosing. I have not been someone who stayed, in most things. I have been someone who moved on. I am telling you this not as a warning but as a context, because I want you to understand that when I tell you that what I intend now is to stay, it is a significant statement. I have thought about it with the same care I give to everything that matters. Myrtle looked at him steadily. I believe you, she said, and I want you to understand something as well. I am not a person who makes this kind of decision without thought. I am not overwhelmed by the romance of the situation. I know who you are, what you have been, and what you are trying to be. I have thought about all of it, and I am here." He reached out and tucked a piece of her hair back from her face with a touch so careful it was almost formal, and his eyes were very warm, and she thought that warmth was perhaps the word she would use for him. Underneath the composure and the reserve and the history, there was this fundamental warmth that he gave out slowly and completely, and she was learning to receive it. In November, the news came that Floyd Cass had been replaced as sheriff. The new sheriff was a man named Arthur Briggs, who had come down from Colorado with a reputation for being genuinely interested in doing the job, and who, within 2 weeks of arriving in Dust Creek, had ridden out to the Triple T to apologize personally to Myrtle for the inadequate response to the cattle theft. He was a compact, red-faced man with a forthright manner, and Myrtle liked him immediately, and she told him that she appreciated the apology and that the cattle had been recovered by a private individual, and that she was not interested in pursuing the matter further. She mentioned Ezekiel Keene to Arthur Briggs with a degree of care, giving no more information than was useful, and being clear that Ezekiel was a neighbor and a man she vouched for. Briggs looked at her with the kind of look that men with good judgment gave to women who they could tell had good judgment themselves, and he said that a man's current character was more interesting to him than a man's past record, provided the current character was clearly established, and that he would take her assessment on its merits. Myrtle told Ezekiel about this conversation that evening, riding the fence line in the gray November light, and he was quiet for a moment after she finished, looking out over the land, and then he said, "You are a better advocate than I have ever had. You advocated for yourself when you rode 30 miles with my cattle," she said. "I am just the person who received the benefit of that." He turned to look at her with that particular expression she had come to know well over the months, the one that was warmth and humor and something deeper underneath, and he said, "Myrtle Turner," in a tone that made it sound like the name itself was something worth saying. "Ezekiel Keene," she said back in the same tone, and he laughed. December was cold and clear, and the work of the ranch was the slower, harder winter work, the extra feed and the checking of water sources and the particular vigilance that cold required. Ezekiel had his own winter work on his place, and they fell into a rhythm that was the rhythm of two neighboring ranchers who also happened to be in love, which meant that the work was shared in the practical ways that proximity made natural, and the evenings were frequently together, and the world between them had grown into something warm and habitual and necessary. There was an evening in December, a Sunday, when they were sitting by the fire in the Triple T kitchen, and the fire was good and the wind was high outside, and Myrtle was mending a length of rope and Ezekiel was reading one of the 3 books she owned, and the quiet was the particular quality of quiet that meant neither of them needed anything to be different, and Myrtle thought that this, specifically this, was what she had been building toward, maybe without knowing it. Since she was old enough to understand that a life could be built, or not built, depending on the choices you made. She looked up from the rope and he was already looking at her over the top of the book, and he lowered it when he saw her looking. "Ask me," she said, because she had been expecting it and had decided that she was not going to wait anymore. He set the book down on the table. He looked at her with those dark, direct eyes, and she could see the thing working in him, the precision and the care, and also underneath it something that was nothing but genuine and straightforward. "I want to marry you," he said. "I want this, what we have in this room right now, to be the permanent condition of my life. I want to work the land next to yours until the work makes me old. I want to know everything about you that I have not yet learned, and I believe there is a great deal still to know, and I want the time required to learn it." He paused. "Myrtle Turner, will you marry me?" The fire snapped in the hearth. The wind went around the corner of the house with a sound like something content. Myrtle set down the rope and looked at the man across the table from her, this man who had come out of the early morning with her stolen cattle and asked for nothing but her name, and who had stayed, and who had been exactly what she had read him to be, honest and hardworking and warm, with the rough edges of a hard life still on him and the clear intention of something better in his eyes. "Yes," she said, "I will." He was around the table before she had fully finished the word, and he pulled her to her feet and held her with both arms, and she put her hands against his chest and felt his heart, and it was beating fast, which surprised her because he was always so composed, and she realized that the composure was a thing he maintained, and not a thing he was made of, that underneath it he felt things as completely as anyone, and that she was the person who got to know that. "You were afraid I might say no," she said, against his shoulder. "I was afraid," he confirmed. "You drove 43 cattle 30 miles through the Red Rock draws," she said, "alone, and you were afraid to ask me to marry you." "Those are not comparable fears," he said, and she could hear the laugh in his voice. "No," she agreed. "This one is bigger." He held her tighter and she let herself be held, and the fire burned warm and the wind blew outside and the cattle were safe in the south pasture, and the world was, in this specific and particular moment, entirely as it should be. They married in February of 1883, in the little church in Dust Creek that had been built 4 years earlier by the Methodist congregation, and which served now for any variety of nonspecific Protestant worship that required a building. The ceremony was performed by the minister, Reverend Aldous Crane, who was a thin, earnest man with large spectacles and a genuine warmth for the people of his community. The witnesses were Arthur Briggs, who had become in 3 months more of a friend to Myrtle than Floyd Cass had been in 3 years, and a woman named Clara Petty, who was the wife of Horace at the feed store and who had taken it upon herself to befriend Myrtle in the months since Harold's death with a persistence that Myrtle had initially found intrusive and had come to find essential. Myrtle wore her best dress, which was the blue wool one that she had worn to her father's birthday the last year before he died, and she had pressed it with great care and put her hair up in the way Clara had shown her. Ezekiel wore his good coat, which he had bought from the dry goods store 2 weeks before the wedding, new and clean and dark blue, and he had shaved for the occasion in a way that made him look somehow both younger and more serious at the same time. And when he saw her come through the door of the church, he looked at her with an expression that was entirely undisguised, and she felt it land on her like warmth. The ceremony itself was short, as ceremonies in 1883 in the New Mexico Territory tended to be, because people had work to get back to, and because brevity was a virtue that the frontier bred into everything. But the words were real, and Myrtle spoke them with a steadiness that surprised even herself, and Ezekiel spoke them with a quietness that was the deepest kind of serious. And when Reverend Crane pronounced them married, and Ezekiel kissed her in front of the 4 people present in that small, cold church, Clara Petty made a sound of genuine happiness that was the most celebratory thing the room contained. And Arthur Briggs cleared his throat with the dignity of a man who was moved, but not going to admit it. They had a supper at the Triple T afterward, the 6 of them including Reverend Crane, and Clara had brought a cake that she had made from a recipe involving molasses and dried fruit that she swore was a wedding tradition in her family going back 3 generations. And the cake was extraordinary, and Myrtle told her so with a sincerity that made Clara beam, and Ezekiel had quiet conversations with Briggs and Crane that seemed to go well, and the evening had the warm, lit quality of something being celebrated properly and genuinely. When the guests had gone and the house was quiet, and the cold February night was pressing softly against the windows, Myrtle and Ezekiel were alone in the house that had been Harold Turner's and was now theirs, and the fire was burning down, and she was sitting on the bed removing the pins from her hair, and he came and sat beside her, and took over the task with the same careful attention he gave to everything, working the pins out one by one, and setting them on the side table. And she sat very still and felt the weight and the length of her hair come loose around her shoulders. "Myrtle Keene," he said, quietly trying it. She turned to look at him. "I was thinking," she said, "that I might keep Turner professionally for the ranch." She looked at him steadily, gauging. "Turner was my father's name and his father's name, and the ranch is the Triple T, and I think he would want his name to stay on it." Ezekiel looked at her with a clear, uncomplicated expression. "I think that is right," he said. "Harold Turner built this place. His name should be on it." "Keen for everything else," she said. "Yes," he said, and leaned forward and kissed her, and the fire went quietly down to embers, and the night was theirs. Spring came the way it did in that part of the territory, fast and purposeful, like a decision being made. The grass came up in the south pasture, and the cattle, all 61 of them now whole and accounted for, and supplemented by 3 new calves born in February, moved through it with the easy contentment of animals that were well cared for. Ezekiel's place, the old Johnson property, had been transformed through the winter months into something genuinely livable, and they went back and forth between the 2 properties depending on the work, spending most nights at the Triple T because the house was better and because it felt more like a home. There was the matter of Ezekiel's past to navigate, and they navigated it together. In March, a man came through Dust Creek who recognized Ezekiel, an older man with a scar across his chin, named Whitfield, who had ridden with the same groups in Texas that Ezekiel had briefly been involved with years before. Whitfield was not trouble exactly, but his presence in town was an uncomfortable reminder that the past did not simply evaporate because you had made other choices. Ezekiel told Myrtle about Whitfield the evening after he had seen him, plainly and without minimizing it, and she listened and thought, and said that they should speak to Arthur Briggs, who was the law and who had already indicated his general philosophy about past versus present. They did together, and Briggs listened with his compact, red-faced attentiveness, and then said that as far as he was concerned, Ezekiel Keene was a rancher and a resident of his territory, and that any trouble that came looking for a man who had left that life behind was trouble that Briggs was disinclined to tolerate. He said it with the authority of a man who meant it, and Whitfield left Dust Creek 3 days later without incident, and the matter did not reoccur. In April, Myrtle learned she was expecting. She knew it in the particular private way that women knew such things before they could say them with certainty. And then the certainty arrived, and she told Ezekiel in the morning, before they had gotten to the day's work, while they were still at the breakfast table with coffee in front of them. He sat very still for a moment, and she watched his face move through something that was large and quiet, and then he looked up at her with an expression that she could only describe as complete, as if everything that made him himself had reorganized itself around this information and found it good. "Are you well?" he asked first, because that was him, that was who he was. "I am perfectly well," she said. "I am strong. This will not be a problem." "No," he agreed. "It will not be a problem." He reached across the table and took her hand, and his grip was warm and sure. "It will be something else entirely." "Something good," she said. "Yes," he said. "Something very good." She was right that she was strong. The pregnancy did not slow her significantly, though Ezekiel assumed more of the heavier work without being asked, and without making it a subject of discussion, which she appreciated enormously, because it was help without the implication that she required managing. Clara Petty came over regularly through the summer, bringing advice that was sometimes useful, and sometimes the particular kind of well-meaning that was best smiled at and thanked, and Myrtle accepted both kinds with equal grace. The summer of 1883 was better than the summer of 1882 in the way that good years were not simply the absence of bad things but the presence of good ones. The grass held. The cattle thrived. The ranch turned a modest profit for the first time since Harold's last year, and Myrtle sat with the accounts in the evening light and felt a satisfaction that was partly pride and partly relief, and partly something that was just straightforward happiness at the physical evidence of work succeeding. Ezekiel's place began to turn toward profit as well. He had brought in 10 head of his own cattle in the spring, purchased through a legitimate transaction with a rancher north of the territory, and they were doing well in the Rio Seco grass. He was a good rancher, careful and observant, and not prone to the shortcuts that cost money and animals in the long run. In September, the territory had a dry spell that threatened the late grass, and there were some anxious weeks of checking the water sources and managing the pasture rotation. But the rain came in October, and the crisis resolved, and by November everything was in good order for the winter. Their son was born on a Thursday in November of 1883, which gave the date a particular resonance for Myrtle, because the last significant Thursday in her life had been the day her cattle were taken, and this cold, clear November Thursday, was a restitution of the most fundamental kind. He was born in the bedroom of the Triple T, with Clara Petty attending, and a doctor from Dust Creek named Morales who had trained in New Mexico City, and who was professional and capable and entirely reassuring. Ezekiel stayed as close as he was permitted and paced when he was not, and Myrtle was aware of his presence in the house even in the hardest hours, and it helped. The baby was healthy and substantial, with Ezekiel's dark coloring and Myrtle's determined expression, which Clara pointed out immediately and which made Ezekiel laugh, that real laugh. They named him Harold Ezekiel Keene, the Harold for Myrtle's father, and the Ezekiel a tradition she intended to carry on. Harold Keene was called Harry for the first few years of his life, though by the time he was old enough to have opinions about such things he expressed a clear preference for his full name, which his parents respected. The winter of 1883 into 1884 was a family winter in the deepest sense, the first whole season they had as three, and it was the warm, contained, intimate time of new parenthood, exhausting and extraordinary in equal measure. Ezekiel did every piece of nighttime care that Myrtle would allow, and she allowed more than most women of her time and place would have, partly because she believed in the principle of it, and partly because she was practical and sleep was necessary for the running of a ranch, and he accepted this with the same serious attentiveness he brought to everything. Spring again, and the work resumed its full pace, with the added complexity of a baby who was now old enough to be interested in everything and old enough to be mobile in concerning ways. Myrtle developed a particular skill at working with Harry on her back in the carrier, she had made after seeing a similar one on a Navajo woman near the river, and Ezekiel took Harry to the barn and the fields with the same matter-of-fact inclusion that told her he intended to raise his son with the knowledge of the land the way he himself had been raised, or should have been raised, with the things that actually mattered. The two ranches began to function more as one entity than two, the division of labor flowing naturally between them based on need and capacity. In the spring of 1885, they made a formal arrangement with the county office that reflected the shared operation, consolidating certain elements while maintaining the separate deeds, both of which mattered to them for reasons they understood clearly. Myrtle expanded the herd to 80 head over the course of 1884 and 1885, careful purchases and good breeding decisions that reflected the education she had gotten from 20 years of watching her father work, and the additional knowledge she had built from her own observation. Ezekiel brought his herd to 35, and the combined operation was, by any reasonable assessment, a solid and prosperous ranch in the central New Mexico territory. Arthur Briggs remained sheriff and remained a friend. He came to supper twice a month or so, and he and Ezekiel had the comfortable friendship of men who had established their respect for each other early and maintained it without drama, and he and Myrtle had the particular friendship of two people who had both decided independently that integrity was more important than convenience and were glad to find someone else who had made the same decision. There were other neighbors who became part of their life. A family named Cardenas had come up from the south in 1884, 8 people including grandparents and children, and they had taken up the land between the Triple T and the river, and they were industrious and warm, and the children were close in age to Harry, and the two families fell into an easy neighborliness that enriched both. Elena Cardenas, the grandmother, had a garden that was the admiration of the territory, and she and Myrtle traded seeds and knowledge and opinions through the fence between their properties with a regularity that became one of the pleasant rhythms of Myrtle's weeks. Tomás Cardenas, Elena's son and the patriarch of the younger generation, was a skilled carpenter, and he and Ezekiel spent a productive 3 months in 1885 building a proper addition to the Triple T house, 2 new rooms that made the house a house for a family rather than a house for a single person, which is what it had been built for. The afternoon they finished the addition, all of them together, Tomás and his eldest son Miguel and Ezekiel, Myrtle brought out cold water and whatever food she had available, and they sat together in the late afternoon light, and the new walls were still smelling of fresh wood, and Harry, who was nearly 2, was walking with the determined unsteadiness of a child who had very recently discovered the capability and could not get enough of it, and the world was as full as it had ever been. "Your father would have liked this house," Ezekiel said to her quietly, while Tomás and Miguel were talking to each other about something technical involving the roof overhang. "He would have," Myrtle said. "He would have liked you." Ezekiel looked at her and his face had that quality it sometimes had in quiet moments, that undisguised warmth, and he said, "I would have liked to know him." "He was a good man," she said. "Not a perfect man, but a good one. He worked hard and he was honest and he loved this land and he loved me." She paused. "I think you are similar in those ways, not in every way but in the ones that matter." He was quiet for a moment, absorbing that, and she thought she could see what it meant to him, to be compared favorably to a man who had built something real and loved his daughter well, and she was glad she had said it. In 1886, when Harry was 2.5 and the ranches were running smoothly, and the life they had built together had achieved the particular solidity of something proven by time and weather and hard work, Myrtle told Ezekiel she was expecting again. He received this news the same way he had received the first, with that still, absorbing quality, and then with the clear and certain gladness underneath. This pregnancy was different from the first, not worse, but different in the way that the body's second experience of something was different from its first, more knowing, less frightened of the unknown. Myrtle moved through it with the confidence of someone who had done this before, and Ezekiel was if possible more attentive than the first time, which she had not thought was possible. In October of 1886, their daughter was born, and she was named Frances Turner Keene, the Turner in the middle, a deliberate choice that Myrtle had made to carry her father's name into the next generation through both his grandchildren. Frances was from the beginning a different person from Harry in every observable way, quieter as a baby but more observant, with Myrtle's dark eyes, and, it emerged over the first months, an absolute certainty about what she wanted that she expressed with a precision that made both her parents laugh with recognition. Harry, at 2.5, was introduced to his sister with the seriousness that small children brought to large things they did not yet fully understand, and his acceptance of her was complete and without caveat from the first day, and he was by 3 already developing the protective attentiveness toward her that he would carry for the rest of his life. The winter of 1886 into 1887 was a hard one in the territory, the kind of cold that settled in deep and stayed, and there were ranchers who lost animals and some who lost everything. The Triple T operation lost 4 head to the cold, which hurt but was survivable, and they got through the winter with the full preparation that Ezekiel had insisted on, the extra feed laid in from the summer, the windbreak fence along the north pasture, the careful monitoring of the water sources. Arthur Briggs came by in February of 1887, in the middle of the hard cold, with the news that a family about 15 miles north had lost their barn and most of their winter stores to a fire, and were in serious difficulty. Myrtle and Ezekiel talked it over at supper that night, and in the morning sent with Briggs a wagon of feed, and 2 of the older cattle they had planned to sell in spring anyway. And they sent some of Myrtle's stored food and 2 blankets that she had been keeping in reserve. It was not everything the family needed, but it was something real, and Briggs came back a week later and said that it had made the difference. "The name Turner is still a good name in this county," he said, looking at Myrtle with the specific respect that had been between them since the beginning. "The name Keene is going to be one too," Myrtle said, looking at her husband across the table. Ezekiel looked at her with that warmth she had been receiving for 4 years now, and which she still felt land on her with the same force as the first time, and said nothing, because there was nothing that needed adding. Spring came again, and the grass came up again, and the cattle moved through the south pasture, and Harry Keene at 3.5 discovered that he could climb the fence rails and was deeply committed to exploring this capability, until his father lifted him down with the combination of firmness and humor that was Ezekiel's particular parenting signature. And Frances, at 6 months, sat in the carrier on Myrtle's back and regarded the world with those dark, assessing eyes, while her mother moved through the work of the ranch with the ease of long practice. It was in April of 1887 that a situation arose that had the potential to be serious and was ultimately not, but which mattered in the way that things which could have been bad and were not mattered, because they clarified things. A man came through Dust Creek looking for Ezekiel, a man from the Texas period, a man named Rourke who had a grievance that was 5 years old and had not softened with time. He was not violent precisely, but he was the kind of trouble that made things complicated, and he came to the ranch and stood at the gate with the particular posture of a man who had been carrying something a long time. Ezekiel went out to meet him alone, which Myrtle allowed, and which she stayed on the porch to observe from a distance that was appropriate for a situation that was not hers but whose outcome was entirely her concern. She watched the 2 men talk for 20 minutes, and she could not hear what was said, but she could read the body language, and what she read was Ezekiel being direct and honest and not backing down and also not escalating. After 20 minutes, Rourke rode away and Ezekiel came back to the house. "What did he want?" she asked. "He wanted an acknowledgement," Ezekiel said, "of something that happened that I was partly responsible for. I gave it to him. I apologized for the part that was mine." He paused. "He lost something because of a situation I was involved in. I could not give it back. I could only say that I knew it and that I was sorry." Myrtle looked at him. "Was the apology true?" she asked. "Yes," he said, "entirely." "Then it was the right thing," she said. He looked at her with an expression that was grateful and tired, and something else that she recognized as the specific relief of a man who had spent years carrying a weight and had just put a piece of it down. She stepped forward and put her hand against his face, and he covered her hand with his, and they stood in the April sunlight on the porch of the Triple T with their children in the house behind them and the cattle in the pasture and the land in every direction. And the thing that had happened was finished, and the thing they were building was ongoing, and the difference between those 2 things was as clear and important as anything Myrtle had ever understood. In 1888, they made an addition to the Rito Seco property as well, because Harry was 4 and Frances was 1, and it was clear that the children needed space, and that the family needed space, and the 2 ranches were by now so interwoven in their operation that it made sense to improve both properties as investments in the shared enterprise. Tomás Cardenas helped again, and his eldest son Miguel, who was 16 now and learning carpentry with an aptitude that was beginning to be impressive. Myrtle designed the addition herself, having thought carefully about what the house needed, and Ezekiel refined her plans with structural knowledge that she lacked, and the result was something they both felt good about. Clara Petty came to see the finished addition and declared it the nicest room in the county, which was an exaggeration but an affectionate one, and Horace Petty shook Ezekiel's hand and said that Myrtle Turner, meaning Myrtle Keene, had been one of the best things to happen to the eastern side of Dust Creek since the road was improved, and Ezekiel agreed with a sincerity that Horace found slightly alarming in its depth. The years settled. Not into stasis, because the land and the cattle and the children and the weather and the territory were all dynamic and demanding, but into a rhythm that was the rhythm of a life fully inhabited. There were good years and harder years, dry summers and cold winters, the ongoing negotiation of the frontier with its unpredictability and its beauty and its indifference to human plans. Through all of it, the Triple T operation held and grew, and the Keene family standing in the community of Dust Creek and the surrounding territory developed into something solid and respected. There was a thing that happened in the summer of 1889 that Myrtle thought about for a long time afterward, because it had the quality of things that showed you who someone was in an unambiguous way. A young man, maybe 19 or 20, came through the territory on a horse that was barely holding together, clearly running from something, clearly frightened, clearly not a hardened criminal but a young man who had made a bad choice and was now living with the consequences of it. He had been accused of stealing from a supply wagon in Arizona, and he was being followed, and he stopped at the Triple T gate with the look of a man who had nowhere left to go. Ezekiel talked to him for a long time on the porch, and then came inside and talked to Myrtle, and they talked together, and what they decided was to take the young man, whose name was Thomas Hale, in for the night and to send word to Arthur Briggs. Briggs came the next morning and talked to Thomas Hale, and the story that came out was more complicated than a simple theft, involving a supply wagon owner who had a record of his own and a dispute over wages that had turned into a scuffle, and a missing box of goods that had been taken during the scuffle but not by Thomas. Arthur Briggs, being a competent lawman and an honest one, investigated further, and within 2 weeks the matter was substantially clarified in Thomas Hale's favor. He was not entirely without fault, but the fault was minor, and the man pursuing him was himself in considerably more legal trouble than Thomas had been. Thomas Hale stayed in the territory, found work with the Cardenas family, and was, in 5 years, a productive member of the community who never forgot what the Keenes had done. "You know why you did that," Myrtle said to Ezekiel, after Briggs had left with Thomas in a situation that was clearly going to resolve well. "I expect I do," he said. "Because someone might have done it for you," she said, "if circumstances had been slightly different." He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said, "and because it was right regardless." "Both things," she agreed. Harry Keene grew up fast and brown in the New Mexico Territory sun, a boy with his father's long limbs and his mother's determined eyes and a personality that was entirely his own, practical and curious, and with a humor that emerged early and developed well. He was riding by 5, really riding by 7, and by 10 he was working the ranch with a competence that his parents acknowledged with the particular satisfaction of people who have passed something real on to someone who receives it properly. Frances Keene grew into a person of formidable precision, quiet in the way that her mother was quiet, not shy but observant, absorbing everything before she spoke, and then speaking with a clarity that made adults pay attention to her in a way that children were not usually paid attention to. She was her father's daughter in the way she listened to things, and her mother's daughter in the way she thought about them, and entirely herself in every other respect. The family expanded in one more way. In 1891, another daughter arrived, and she was named Ida Mae Keene, after no one in particular but with names that both Myrtle and Ezekiel simply liked the sound of together, which seemed like a sufficient reason. Ida was sunny from the beginning in a way that neither Harry nor Frances had been. Not that the other two were difficult, but that Ida was specifically easy. A baby who ate well and slept well and regarded the world with a benevolent interest that never entirely left her. 3 children, which in 1891 was a modest number by the standards of the territory, but which was the number that the Triple T household contained and sustained and celebrated, and which was enough. The house that Harold Turner had built for one person, and then 2 had become a house for 5, full of noise and food and work, and the particular domestic richness of a family that worked together, because the work was shared by all of them as soon as they were old enough to contribute anything. Ezekiel Keene at 36 was a different man in visible ways, from the one who had ridden up the Eastern Road with 43 cattle on a Thursday morning in August of 1882. The weathering had deepened, and the gray was beginning to show at his temples, and the lines of his face were the lines of a man who spent his life outside in a demanding country. But the eyes were the same, those direct dark eyes, and the quality of his attention was the same, and the laugh was the same, that real, infrequent laugh that Myrtle had been collecting since the first time she heard it. Myrtle Keene at 33 was not a woman who had grown soft with prosperity, because the life did not permit softness, but she had grown fuller, in the sense of someone who had filled in all the places that grief and fear had emptied out, who had been refilled not just by happiness, but by the deeper thing underneath happiness, meaning, purpose, the sense that what you were doing with your days mattered, and that the people you were doing it with mattered absolutely. She thought sometimes about the morning he had come up the road. She thought about what she had felt standing on the porch with her coffee going cold while the dust rose and the cattle moved out of the early morning. She thought about the way he had stopped at the gate and waited, about the way his voice had carried across the distance without being raised, about the question he had asked, the only thing he had asked, after 30 miles and 43 cattle and everything that represented. She thought about the courage of that, which she had not recognized at the time as courage because she had been too startled by the strangeness of it, but which she recognized now. He had returned the cattle because it was right. He had asked her name because she was the thing he actually wanted. He had not dressed it up or made it transactional or demanded anything. He had just asked her name, and waited, and the simplicity of it, looked at from the distance of 9 years, was one of the most romantic things she had ever encountered. She told him this one evening, a summer evening in 1891, with Ida sleeping and Harry and Francis doing whatever they were doing somewhere in the back of the house, and Ezekiel and Myrtle were on the porch with the evening cooling around them and the land golden in the late light. "I was thinking," she said, "about the day you came with the cattle." He looked over at her. "What about it?" "You asked only one thing," she said. "You drove 43 head 30 miles and you asked only for my name." "Yes," he said. "That was very brave," she said. He considered this for a moment, looking out at the land. "I did not think of it as brave," he said. "I thought of it as—" He paused and she waited, knowing the pause. "I had already decided I wanted to know you. Whatever you said, whatever you were, I had already decided that. Asking your name was just the first necessary step." "And if I had been unpleasant," she asked, "if I had been unkind or sharp, or if the answer to the question of who you were looking at had been deeply disappointing, then I would have driven the cattle away again and been sorry about it," he said, and the corner of his mouth moved. "You would not have," she said. "No," he agreed. "But it is a better story if I say I would." She laughed, and he turned to look at her when she laughed, and his face had that quality it had always had when she laughed, the specific pleasure of it, as if her laughter was something he had never gotten entirely accustomed to and always found newly good. "Ezekiel Keene," she said. "Myrtle Turner," he said. "Keene," she corrected. "Both," he said. "You are both. You always have been." She reached over and took his hand in the evening light, and they sat together on the porch of the house that Harold Turner had built, and that they had expanded and improved and filled with children and work and the ordinary, extraordinary business of a life built right. And the sun went down slowly over the red mesas, and the cattle settled in the south pasture, and the voices of Harry and Francis drifted from inside the house, and Ida would wake in an hour or so and want feeding. And there was work tomorrow and work the day after that. And all of it, every bit of it, was exactly as it should be. The Triple T under Myrtle and Ezekiel Keene ran for another 4 decades, long past the point where the New Mexico Territory became the state of New Mexico in 1912. though neither of them put much stock in the distinction, because the land was the land, and the work was the work, and the family was the family regardless of what the government was calling things. Harry Keene took over the primary management of the ranch in the early 1900s, bringing in his wife, a woman named Dorothy from the Albuquerque Valley, who was everything Harry needed and who Myrtle approved of within one conversation, and who Ezekiel approved of when she demonstrated a genuinely sophisticated understanding of cattle management. The younger properties were folded into the one operation, the two ranches finally officially combined under one deed, the Turner Keene Ranch as it was formally recorded, both names in the title, both histories honored. Frances Keene became a schoolteacher, which surprised no one who had known her as a child, and taught in Dust Creek for 30 years, and the students who came through her classroom received the same complete, patient attention that she had learned from watching her parents engage with the world. Ida Keene married a surveyor named Philip Mercer, who was a good man with a gift for mathematics and a genuine love for the territory, and they settled 20 miles north and were regular and welcome presences at the Triple T for the rest of their lives. Arthur Briggs retired from the sheriff's office in 1899 and spent his retirement years in a house 2 streets from the church in Dust Creek, and he and Ezekiel played chess on Saturday afternoons for 15 years, and Myrtle occasionally joined them and usually won, which Briggs claimed was irregular for a woman, and which Myrtle ignored. Clara Petty outlived Horace by 12 years and lived to be 81, and she attended every significant event the Keene family had for 4 decades, and when she finally died, Myrtle said the words at her funeral that Clara would have said herself, that she had been a woman who made the world warmer than she found it, which was the best thing you could say about anyone. Ezekiel Keene died in 1928, at the age of 73, on a Tuesday in October with the sky the deep blue that October brought to New Mexico, and the land golden in the afternoon light. He died at the Triple T, in the bedroom of the house that had become theirs, with Myrtle beside him and Harry and Dorothy downstairs and Frances having arrived that morning from Dust Creek, where she had received the word. He died quietly and without great pain, and his last clear words were to Myrtle, and they were simple and direct in the way everything he said had always been simple and direct, and they were enough. Myrtle Turner Keene outlived him by 7 years, years that were different without him but not empty, because the house was still full and the family was still present and the work, in its reduced and easier form, still continued. She sat on the porch on summer evenings and watched the sun go down over the same red mesas and thought about the morning he had come up the Eastern Road, that particular Thursday morning in August of 1882, when she had been standing on the porch with her coffee going cold and the dust had been rising on the Eastern Road. She thought about 43 cattle coming around the bend of the road. She thought about a tall man on a gray horse, riding with the reins loose in his left hand. She thought about the way he had stopped at the gate and waited, and the way his voice had carried across the morning air, and the one thing he had asked, the only thing after everything. "What is your name?" She thought about the courage of a man who had come out of a hard life with his hands full of someone else's cattle and his heart full of nothing but the desire to do one right thing, and having done it, to ask for nothing except the chance to know her. She thought about the look on his face when she had told him. She thought about every morning since, every summer morning and winter morning and spring and fall morning, all the mornings of a life, and she was grateful for everyone. And she was grateful most specifically for the Thursday when the dust had risen on the Eastern Road, and the cattle had come around the bend, and she had understood that something was coming back to her and had not known, could not have known, that it was more than cattle, that it was everything. Myrtle Turner Keene died in 1935 at the age of 77 at the Triple T Ranch, in the same bedroom where her husband had died 7 years before, with her children around her and her grandchildren in the house, and the October sky the same deep blue it had always been. The ranch was in good hands. The family was strong. The land was cared for. Harold Turner's name was on the deed, and so was Ezekiel Keene's, and so was hers. She had built what she had set out to build, and the man who had helped her build it had begun the whole thing with the simplest and most extraordinary question she had ever been asked. Just her name. That was all he had ever needed. That had been enough for everything.